Your brother inherits the farm. You can keep scanning groceries. My father said it with his glass raised, the good crystal, the kind that only comes out at Christmas. He waited for the laugh, and he got it. A warm ripple around a table of 16 people who'd watched me grow up and decided somewhere along the way that I was the one who hadn't. My brother smirked into his wine, and I did the thing I'd spent 19 years perfecting, being the daughter nobody in that house ever bothered to quote. I said nothing. I folded my hands and let the toast hang there in the candlelight, because not one person at that table had ever once asked why their farms were still standing. That was the moment the manager of the biggest grocery chain in 3 counties set down his drink, crossed the room, stopped behind my father's chair, looked straight at me and said, "Wait, aren't you the woman who—" Before I tell you how he finished that sentence and what it did to that room, do me a favor, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. My name is Nora Halverson. I'm 41. And to understand why a grocery man knew my name when my own father pretended not to, I have to take you back 19 years to the last Christmas I let myself cry in that house. That December, my father sat me down at the same kitchen table where he'd taught me almost nothing, and he told me the money was gone. Not gone, spent. There'd been a college fund, $40,000 my grandmother had left with my name on the envelope, and sometime that autumn it had quietly become a new milking parlor and a down payment on my brother's future. "A degree won't milk a cow, Nora," he said, and he said it gently, which was worse. Grant was 19. Grant was the one who'd stay. I was the one who read too much and asked too many questions and would, everyone agreed, be fine. I didn't argue. I'd already learned the family rule by heart. The person who reacts is the person who loses. So I nodded and I cleared the plates, and 3 weeks later I had a 1-room apartment over a hardware store and a job I took for exactly one reason. It started on Monday. Ridgeline Markets, the biggest grocery chain in the region, though back then it was just the place that was hiring. On my first shift, a manager handed me a name tag still warm from the laminator. Nora, it read, and under my name, in the cheerful company font, "Happy to help." I almost laughed. It was the first thing in years with only my name on it and nobody else's plans attached. So I scanned groceries. My father would say that phrase 19 years later, like it was the whole of me. And here's the part he never understood. It was an education. A register is a data set wearing a coat. Stand behind one for 8 hours a day and you learn to read people faster than they can hide. The man buying a single steak and the good bourbon on a Tuesday, the young mother counting coins for formula, a whole town's grief showing up as a cart of casserole dishes 3 days before a funeral. Nobody's announced yet. You learn what moves and what sits. You learn you can read an entire county by what comes off its shelves. I was good at it. Not happy to help good. The other kind. I started noticing what the buyers upstairs were missing, which local growers we kept selling out of, which supplier shorted us every 3rd week and blamed the weather. I wrote it down. I wrote everything down. It's the one habit my father did hand me, though he'd sooner die than call it a gift. One spring, a district buyer picked up 4 pages I'd left on the wrong desk and asked who Nora was. That's how it starts sometimes. Somebody finally asks who you are. Over the next 15 years, I stopped scanning and started sourcing. Cashier, then front-end lead, then buyer, then the person who decided which farms filled our shelves across 3 counties. I learned the back of that business the way I'd learned the front, patiently, in writing, without a single soul back home ever asking one question about it. To my family, I worked at the grocery store. And I want to be honest with you because this story doesn't work if I'm not. I let that stand. Year after year, I let it stand. The easy read on that is the one strangers always offer, that I was weak. A woman starving for love, keeping her head down, hoping to be chosen. That read is wrong. I kept my head down because somewhere around 22, I decided that being useful was the same as being safe. If I was the wall the house stood on, no one could ever pull me out of it. So I made myself useful everywhere. I fixed things. I balanced things. I showed up to that farmhouse for 19 straight Christmases with a dish in my hands and a smile I'd rehearsed in the rearview mirror, chasing 2 words my father had never once said and never would. Good job. I told myself I kept coming back for my mother. Later, I told myself I came back for my daughter. Both were true. Neither was the whole of it. The whole of it is that I was still the girl in the cold car, waiting for that door to open and someone inside to say my name like it counted. It took 19 years and 1 raised glass to make me stop waiting. But I'm ahead of myself. First, I have to tell you about the Bishops, because everything my father found out too late started with an old man I helped when I was too young to know I'd need it. The Bishops ran a small dairy about 6 miles from my father's place, and by the time I was working the front end at Ridgeline, that dairy was dying the quiet way small farms die. A little more every month, with nobody in town saying the word out loud. Walt Bishop came through my line most Fridays. He was somewhere past 70, with hands like old harness leather and a habit of counting his cash twice before he handed it over, because there was never quite enough of it. One February evening, his total came to $61, and his wallet came to $40. He started putting things back, the coffee first, then the good butter, his ears going red under his cap. I told him the butter was on a promotion the register hadn't caught up to yet, and I covered the difference out of my own pocket, and I said it fast so he wouldn't have room to argue. He wasn't a man built to take charity. I made sure it didn't look like any. That should be the whole story of it. It wasn't, because I did something that felt even smaller. The Bishops kept a few dozen laying hens and a stubborn line of honey on the side, and I'd tasted both, and I knew our local shelf was thin. So I walked their eggs and their honey up to the produce buyer myself and made the case, and I kept making it, quarter after quarter, until Ridgeline was moving every jar the Bishops could put up. It wasn't a rescue. It was one clerk being tidy about a shelf. I never counted it. I want to be clear about that because it matters to everything that comes later. I did not walk around thinking I'd done a kind thing. I forgot about it the way you forget a Tuesday. Walt Bishop did not forget. Neither did his wife, Ruth. But I wouldn't understand that for another 18 years, and by then Walt would be gone, and I'd be standing in my father's dining room while a stranger said my name out loud. Hold on to the Bishops. They come back. Because here's what was happening at the same time. In the house I'd left. I was being edited out. Not in one dramatic stroke. My family didn't do dramatic. We were worse than dramatic. We were polite. It went in layers, and I can measure every one of them. My high school photo came off the mantle the year Grant got engaged to make room. It moved to the hallway, then to the landing, then to a box in the attic marked Old Frames. When the family group text started, the one where the farm's whole future got planned, harvest by harvest, holiday by holiday, I was on it for about a year. Then a new one appeared without me, and I only learned it existed because my mother forwarded me a photo from it by accident, and I could see the number of participants at the top. In 19 years, my name showed up in the planning threads exactly 0 times. It showed up 4 times in the other kind, the ones that started, "So who's going to handle Nora about Christmas this year?" That was the accounting, 0 and 4. You can dress a thing like that up as busyness, as everyone just having a lot going on. I dressed it up that way for years. It's a lie that costs nothing and buys you one more holiday of pretending, and I bought it every December, right up until the December I didn't. Somewhere in the middle of all that editing, I built a life they never once looked at. I made director of regional sourcing before I turned 36. I had a daughter, Poppy. I raised her by myself in a 2-bedroom apartment with a view of a parking lot, and she is the most watchful person I've ever met, which is a thing you become when it's just you and your mother reading the world together. I signed my name on contracts that decided whether 100 farms had a buyer that year, and every holiday I drove back to a table where my father introduced me, when he introduced me at all, as Nora. She's over at the grocery store. There was one Thanksgiving I almost corrected him. I had the sentence loaded. My brother had just finished explaining commodity prices to the room, getting half of it wrong, and my father was nodding like scripture, and I opened my mouth to say what I actually did for a living. Then I looked around that table and understood all at once that it wouldn't land as pride. It would land as me making it about me, as Nora being dramatic. So I closed my mouth and passed the potatoes, and I let it stand, and I hated myself a little on the drive home, the way you do. I'm telling you this so you understand. Nobody hid the truth from my family. The truth sat in plain sight for 15 years, wearing a name tag, and not one of them ever leaned in close enough to read it. Then the plant closed, and the whole county's math changed at once. Delham Foods ran the processing plant that took in milk and produce from every small operation across 3 counties. The Bishop's old route, my father's route, 60-odd families who'd never met a spreadsheet they trusted. When Delham shut its doors that spring, those farms lost their buyer overnight. No buyer, no income, and the notes on the barns and the balers came due with nothing behind them. By early summer, there were 61 family farms in 3 counties looking at foreclosure, and my father's was one of them, though he'd have chewed glass before he told me so. I was the head of sourcing for the largest grocer in the region, which is to say, I was the one person in a 200-mile radius with the authority to build those farms a new door. So I built it. I put together a local sourcing program, we called it Homegrown, that let Ridgeline buy direct from every stranded operation Delham had dropped. It took me 4 months, a stack of approvals and more meetings than I care to count. And when the first farms went onto the intake list, I put 2 names near the top myself, quietly, the way I do everything. One was Bishop, the other was Halverson. I never told my father. The program went out under Ridgeline's name, not mine. That's how these things work, and that's how I wanted it. All he ever knew was that a grocery program had come along at the right moment and kept the bank off his back. He toasted it once, that year at Christmas. He said the Lord looks after farmers. He looked right at me when he said the grace, and he did not see a thing. The first time I heard my father mention homegrown to my face, he was using it to explain why he didn't need anybody's help. We're independent people, he told the table, buttering his roll. Always have been. A man makes his own way out here. Grant said amen, and I sat with my hands in my lap and the whole ledger in my head, and I said, "That's good, Dad, because the thing about being the wall that holds up the house is that the house never once thanks the wall." I could have told him. You're maybe wondering why I didn't, right then, with the proof warm in my hands. The honest answer is that I still wanted the good job more than I wanted the win. As long as I stayed quiet, there was a version of the future where he found out on his own and turned to me with something like wonder. I kept that version alive for years. It cost me. But I want you to know it was never about not having the cards. I had the cards the whole time. And that summer, without meaning to, I laid one of them on the table, just to see if it would hold. A neighbor of my father's, a man named Ostrander, called the farm in a panic because his whole strawberry crop was about to rot. The distributor who'd promised to take it had gone silent. My father couldn't help him. Grant couldn't help him. My mother, not knowing what I did and only knowing I worked at a store, said, half as a joke, "Well, ask Nora. She's over there." So Ostrander asked me, embarrassed, expecting nothing. I made one call. By the next morning, a Ridgeline truck was at his cooler, and by the weekend, every flat of those berries was on a shelf with a little card that said, "Grown in this county." It was nothing to me. A Tuesday, again. But out here, that kind of thing travels. Within a week, half the growers in the township knew that Wendell Halverson's girl had fixed in one phone call what none of the men could fix in 3 days. One of the people who heard about it was a man named Ray Dunmore, who ran the Ridgeline stores for the whole district and who knew exactly, professionally, precisely who I was. He tracked me down after, half laughing. "You're telling me," he said, "that the woman who built Homegrown is from out here, and none of these people know it?" None of them, I said, and let's keep it that way. He didn't keep it that way, but I didn't know that yet, and neither did the man about to raise a glass in my honor without knowing my name. Walt Bishop died the following March. I read it in the county paper before anyone in my family thought to mention it, and I drove out to the little Lutheran church on the gravel road and sat in the back, in a coat too nice for that pew, and I didn't tell a soul why I'd come. Ruth Bishop found me anyway. She was smaller than I remembered, the way widows get in the first weeks, and she took both my hands in both of hers, and she said a thing I've never been able to shake. "You kept us," she said. 20 years ago, when nobody else would carry us, you put us on that shelf and you kept us there. Walt used to say you were the only one at that store who ever looked at him like a man instead of a line. I honestly didn't know what to say because I'd half forgotten. That's the part I need you to hold on to. The thing that meant the whole world to the Bishops was a thing I'd done so lightly I couldn't have told you the year I did it. I mumbled that it had been no trouble, and Ruth Bishop looked at me the way you look at somebody who has failed to grasp the size of their own life. And she patted my hand and she said, "You'll see." Then she went back to her husband's coffin and I drove home and I told no one. Out here, though, a story like that doesn't die with the man it happened to. Ruth told it. She told it at the co-op and the fellowship hall and every kitchen table that would have her, because it was the good thing she had left of Walt. The girl from Ridgeline who kept them standing when the world let go. She just never had a last name to hang on it that meant anything to the people she told. To them, I was the Ridgeline girl. To me, the Bishops were a receipt I didn't know I was keeping. And they weren't the only one. There was a young dairy family 2 townships over, immigrants, the kind of small operation that gets dropped first and defended never, who'd have lost everything the year Dellum closed if I hadn't signed their milk onto homegrown in the second week. I never met them. I signed a form, but I heard later that they said grace over that name at their own table. Teaching their children there was a woman who'd saved them. Not one of those children could have picked my father's checkout girl out of a lineup. That's the arithmetic I was living inside, and I want you to see both columns the way I did. In one column, my family's table, my worth was being subtracted, one Sunday and one bless her heart at a time. In the other column, strangers' tables, it was being added up like a prayer. 2 ledgers running in opposite directions, and I was the only person alive who could read both. Let me show you the subtracting, because you should feel how patient it was. Let me give you 3 Sundays. The first was an ordinary summer visit, the kind where you bring a pie and pretend. My father had a neighbor over, a man named Doyle who'd known me since I was small, and over the pot roast, Doyle asked, friendly, what I was up to these days. Before I could answer, my father answered for me. "Nora's over at Ridgeline," he said, salting his plate. "Bless her heart, she never quite found her feet like Grant did. But she's steady. We're glad she's got the store." He said it with real affection. That's what you have to understand. The affection you feel for a thing that turned out smaller than you'd hoped. And I sat there with my fork and let it pass, and I didn't say that at that very moment the milk on his table had reached it through a program I'd built, that Doyle's own farm across the road was on the same program, that the store my father was glad I had was one I helped run for 3 counties. I let Doyle nod at me kindly, the way you nod at someone who didn't make it. The roast was good. My mother uses her mother's recipe. I said so, and I meant it. And I said nothing else. The second Sunday cut deeper because it was the day they made Grant the heir out loud. It wasn't formal. My family finds formal pretentious. It was a supper where my father tapped his glass and said he and Grant had worked out the future of the place. And everyone understood, and everyone was happy, and Grant stood up and made a little speech about stewardship and the next generation. And in the middle of it, he decided to explain, to a room that included me, how the grocery business actually works, margins, distributors, why the small farms were struggling. He got most of it confidently, charmingly wrong. And when he finished, a cousin laughed and pointed her wine at me and said, Well, maybe Nora can get us the employee discount. And the whole table laughed, my father loudest of all, and I laughed too. Because that is what you do. Because the alternative is being the woman who couldn't take a joke at her brother's big night. I'll tell you what it costs to laugh at that. It costs a small piece of the roof of your mouth. You swallow the true thing so many times it stops feeling like a thing at all. Just a texture, just the taste of that house. I drove home that night and Poppy asked why I was quiet, and I said I was tired, which was true, in the way that one word can hold a whole life. The third Sunday I wasn't even there for, and it's the one that told me the wall was nearly finished. Because while my family was making me smaller at their table, the county was making me larger at everyone else's, and the two things were on a collision course, and I was the only one who could see it coming. Ruth Bishop's gospel had spread. Growers had started calling the woman behind homegrown, the homegrown woman, half legend, a saint they'd never met, and blessing her over suppers in kitchens I'd never sat in, for saving farms I'd only ever seen as names on a sheet. Ray Dunmore saw it too. He stopped me in a parking lot after a grower had cornered him, just to ask if the rumors were real. "You can't keep both of these true forever," he told me. "One day somebody puts your name next to your face in front of the wrong people, and Nora, you don't get to pick the room." He was right. I just assumed I had more time. I assumed the collision, when it finally came, would happen out there, in a co-op, a checkout line, somewhere among people who'd only be glad. I did not imagine it would happen at my father's Christmas table, 5 minutes after he told 16 people I could keep scanning groceries. But first came the winter I found out what my father had chosen not to say, and that's a different kind of cold. Before I get to that winter, there's one more measure of the layers I keep talking about, and it's the clearest one I have. My grandmother, the one who'd left me that college fund, the one person in that family who ever looked at me like I was going somewhere, died when I was 31. I flew back. I helped my mother pick the hymns. And at the service, they handed out a little printed program, cream-colored, her photograph on the front, and inside, under Survived By, they'd listed the grandchildren by name. They listed 9 of them. There were 10 of us. I read that program in a hard church pew, and I counted, twice the way Walt Bishop counted his cash, and the number came up 9, and the missing one was me. Nobody did it to be cruel. That's the thing you have to understand about my family. Nobody hated me. Grant hadn't sat down with a red pen and struck me out. Somebody had simply typed the list from memory and I hadn't come to mind. I'd been forgotten the way a light left on in a back room gets forgotten. And forgetting, it turns out, does the exact same work as hatred, only cleaner and with better manners. I didn't say anything. Of course I didn't. I folded that program in half, and then in half again, and I put it in my coat pocket, and I have it still. It lives in a drawer with the name tag. 2 pieces of laminated paper that between them tell you everything about who that family thought I was. Happy to help and not worth listing. So when I tell you my father was patient, hear the whole architecture of it. He wasn't cruel the way men are cruel in movies. He never raised a hand. He rarely even raised his voice. He thought yelling was for people who'd lost the argument. He was worse than cruel. He was patient. He was a man who could carry a small, cold verdict about you for 30 years and never say it out loud, just live by it, the way you live by a fact. And he had a system, which is the part that still catches in my throat. Every winter, he sat at the kitchen computer and worked up what he called the farm review, a full accounting of the operation, who'd earned what, who'd cost what, the plan for spring. Grant was in every one of those meetings from the age of 16. I was never once invited, not as a girl, not as a grown woman with a degree in the exact thing they were doing badly. The one meeting in that house where the future got decided was the one meeting I didn't exist for. I understood the logic of it. I even forgave it for a while. He'd been raised hard by a harder man, taught that a farm goes to the sun and love is a thing you show by keeping the lights on, not by saying words. I understood all of it. But empathy has a shelf life. It goes bad the day the person you keep forgiving starts using your understanding as permission to push you a little further out of your own family, one polite inch at a time, until you're a name they have to handle at Christmas. I stopped forgiving him the winter I found out what he'd chosen not to say, but before that there was Grant, who almost gave part of it away without meaning to. That autumn, Grant called me, which he never did, and I could hear him arranging his voice into something generous before he got there. "So, listen," he said. "You're over at Ridgeline. I'll be taking over the operation soon, and I want our milk and our sweet corn moving through the good stores, not the discount route. You've been there forever. Think you could put in a word with whoever does the buying?" He was asking me to do him a favor. He was asking the head of sourcing to go beg the head of sourcing. Sit in how strange that was, because I did, for a long, quiet moment on the phone. I could have ended 19 years right there with one flat sentence. Instead, I said, "I'll see what I can do." And I did see. Halverson Milk was already moving through the good stores because I'd put it there 2 years before, under the very program my brother was now asking me to sneak him into. I said nothing. I let him thank me, warmly, for a favor I'd granted before he knew there was one to ask. That should have been the worst of it. It wasn't. Because a few weeks later, my mother, on one of our short, careful calls, mentioned that your father heard the funniest thing about that grocery program. My hand went still on the counter. She didn't know what she was holding. A fellow from the co-op board had told Dad, almost a year back now, that the whole homegrown thing, the program that saved this county, had been built by a Halverson, by his Nora. He didn't believe it at first, she said, laughing a little. Then he got real quiet about it. You know how he is, never brought it up again. Never brought it up again. I stood in my kitchen with the phone to my ear and did the math the way I do. My father had known for a year. He'd known while he told the table we were independent people who make our own way. He'd known while he introduced me as the girl over at the store. He'd held, in his 2 hands, the one fact that could have turned to me and said the 2 words. And he'd looked at it, gone quiet, and put it in a box in the attic of himself, right next to my photograph. My whole life, I'd believed my father simply didn't see me. That was the lie I could live with. The truth was so much colder. He'd seen me clearly, at last, a full year before that Christmas, and he'd decided, on purpose, to keep pretending he hadn't. Because the moment he said it out loud, the son wasn't the one who'd saved the farm anymore. The daughter was, and there was no room in his story for that. That was the winter I understood my father's only real weapon was a story, one he told himself and everyone else, warm and certain, about who mattered in that house. And I understood, finally, what I'd been holding all along. Not documents, not a lawyer, just the plain, printed, unarguable fact of 61 farms still standing because of me. You can call a woman dramatic. You cannot call a county still standing dramatic. It just sits there, being true. I drove home from that phone call, and I very nearly decided I was never walking into that house again. It wasn't only my father. If I'm going to tell you the truth all the way down, I have to tell you about my mother, because she was the one person in that house who ever came close to seeing me, and she chose not to, and hers is the quieter heartbreak of the 2. My mother, Carol, is the softest place in that family. She's the one who remembers how you take your coffee and which grandchild is scared of dogs and what year the barn flooded. She kept the peace the way some women keep a garden, constantly, on her knees, pulling up anything that might grow into a fight. And I want to be fair to her, because it took me a long time to see that peacekeeping isn't the same as kindness. Sometimes the person keeping the peace is just the person deciding, over and over, whose comfort is worth more. In our house, it was always my father's, and the weed she pulled up every single time quietly before it could bloom into a problem was me. There was one night, a few years back, after some holiday, I don't even remember which, when the 2 of us were alone at the sink, her washing, me drying, the men in the other room with the game on, and out of nowhere she said, not looking at me, You know, you were always the capable one, even when you were small. I never had to worry about you." She said it like a compliment. She meant it as one. And I stood there with a dish towel in my hands and understood that I was hearing, in the gentlest possible voice, the exact sentence that had erased me. I was the one she never had to worry about, so she never did. All the worry, all the attention, all the fierce protective love a mother has to ration, it had all gone to the ones who needed it loudly, and I'd been billed, my whole life, for the crime of managing on my own. "Mom," I almost said. I had it right there. I could have told her everything. The title, the program, the 61 farms, the fact that the capable one she never worried about was quietly holding up half the county, her own husband's farm included. I opened my mouth. And then I looked at her face, tired and kind in the light over the sink, and I understood what telling her would actually do. It wouldn't make her proud. It would make her choose. She'd have to hold my truth in one hand and my father's story in the other and decide, out loud, which one got to be real. And I already knew which way that scale tipped, because it had tipped that way at every meal of my life. I couldn't do it to her, and if I'm honest, I couldn't do it to me. Because as long as I never asked her to choose, I never had to watch her choose him. So I dried the dish. I said, "I do okay, Mom." And she patted my arm with a wet hand and said, "I know you do, honey. You always do." And that, "You always do," is maybe the loneliest sentence anyone has ever said to me with love. That's the thing nobody tells you about being the strong one. People stop checking on the wall. Why would they? Walls hold. Walls are fine. Nobody brings a wall a cup of coffee and asks how it's been. And the more you hold, the less anyone thinks to ask, until one day you realize the reward for a lifetime of never needing anyone is a family that has genuinely forgotten you're a person who might. I never blamed my mother the way I blamed my father, and I want to be careful about why. My father knew and chose the story. My mother didn't let herself know, which is a different sin, a softer one, but it kept the lights on in his version of us just the same. Every time she smoothed a thing over, every time she pulled me up before I could grow into an inconvenient truth at that table, she was pouring one more thin coat on the same wall he was building. She'd tell you she was holding the family together. She was. She just never once asked what the family was being held together around, or who was getting walled up inside it. I used to think that if it ever came down to it, if the story ever cracked wide open in front of everyone, my mother would be the one who couldn't look at me, that the softness would fail me last and worst. I was wrong about that, as it turned out, but I didn't know it yet. All I knew that winter, standing in my kitchen with the phone gone quiet and my father's year-long silence sitting in my chest like a stone, was that I had a father who'd seen me and lied, and a mother who'd loved me too gently to see me at all. And that was the winter I decided for real this time that I was done driving back. I didn't walk away, though. I'd like to tell you it was strength that changed my mind. It was an 8-year-old. That night, I came home from the phone call with my jaw set, and Poppy was at the kitchen table doing long division with her tongue between her teeth. And I said, mostly to myself, "I don't think we're doing Christmas at Grandpa's this year." She looked up. She has my mother's eyes and none of my mother's caution. Why not? And I gave her the child-sized version that Grandpa didn't always treat Mommy very nicely, that some people just never learn how to be fair. She thought about it the way she thinks about everything, all the way to the bottom. Then she said, "But you're the one who fixes the farms. Ruth's grandma told me at the county fair." I hadn't known she knew. And then she said the thing I keep in a drawer in my chest, right next to the name tag and the folded program. "If you stop going, does that mean they win?" Out of the mouth of a child, the exact wrong question and the exact right one at the same time. She was 8. To her, it was a game with a score. To me, it should never have been about winning at all. But she'd put her small finger on the one thing I'd never let myself see. I hadn't driven back to that house for 19 years because I was weak. I'd driven back because I refused to let the story be true. Every Christmas I walked through that door was me saying, without a word, "You don't get to erase me, because I am still here holding this roof up, whether any of you look up or not." So I decided I'd go one more time. Not to beg, not to tell them either. I'd made a hard peace with never telling them. Just to stand in that house as the person I actually was. Let that be enough. And let my daughter watch her mother be a wall that doesn't apologize for holding. And then, that same autumn, the county nearly went under a second time. And this time, the flood had my own company's name on it. Here's the part of my job my family will never picture, because in their heads, I'm bagging apples. Homegrown wasn't a monument. It was a line item. That fall, it came up for its 3-year renewal, and a new vice president 2 levels above me, a man who'd never smelled a barn, who measured the world in basis points, looked at the thin margins on rural direct sourcing and proposed killing the whole thing to route everything through a national distributor. Cleaner numbers on his slide. 61 farms dropped again, this time not by Dellum, but by us. By me, if I let it happen. So I did the only thing I have ever really known how to do. I went to war with a spreadsheet. I spent 6 weeks building the case. I pulled 3 years of shelf data. I proved that Grown in this county was outselling the national label 3-to-1 in every store in the district, that the loyalty we'd bought with those little shelf cards was worth more than the pennies we'd save routing around it. And then I sat in a glass conference room across from men who'd decided the answer before I walked in, and I did the one thing I'm actually made of. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I put the column on the table, and I let it be witnessed. Numbers don't get emotional. Numbers don't get called dramatic. They just sit there and are true. And the whole trick of my life has been learning to stand next to them quietly while other people run out of arguments. For about 10 days after that meeting, I didn't know if I'd won. I'll tell you how I spent one of those 10 days, because it's the closest I ever came to breaking my own rule about staying quiet. On the Saturday, in the middle of the wait, I drove out to the county alone. I didn't tell anyone. I just drove the back roads past the farms on the intake list, past the bishop's old place, past Ostrander's, past a dozen mailboxes with names I only knew from a spreadsheet, and I looked at the little laminated Grown in this county card still hanging in the roadside stands, curling now with cold. And I did the math I do, except this time the math was a countdown. If the program died, those stands went dark by spring. The bank got the Ostranders by summer. And my father, who'd spent a year knowing I'd saved him and choosing not to say it, would lose the farm to the exact daughter he'd bet against. And never even know it was me who'd failed to catch him the second time. I sat in my car at the end of my father's road with the engine running and the heat ticking, 41 years old, in almost the exact spot I'd cried at 22. I didn't cry this time. I just looked at the house for a while, and then I drove home and went back to work, because the only thing that was ever going to save any of them was me being right about the numbers, and I was going to be right if it killed me. I want you to hold those 10 days with me, because they're the coldest irony in the whole story. For 10 days, the daughter who had secretly saved her father's farm was 10 days away from being the reason he lost it. We won the renewal on a Thursday. I remember, because that evening Ray Dunmore called, and he wasn't laughing this time. "You know what you just did," he said. "You saved every one of them a second time, and they still don't know your name." Then he went careful, the way a decent man goes careful before he says a thing you won't like. "Nora, people out here talk about the homegrown woman like she's a saint they've never met. That catches up to you one day, and you don't get to choose the day." I told him to keep it quiet. Old reflex, worn smooth. He went silent in a way I should have paid more attention to. Have you ever done the math on your own family? Added up the years, the holidays, the quiet times you covered for people who couldn't even say your name right? If part of you is sitting there doing that arithmetic right now, do one thing for me before we reach the end. Put in the comments the one thing you did for them that they never knew about. I read every single one. Because here's the piece I didn't have. Walking into that last Christmas, the small thing that turned an ordinary holiday into the loudest silence of my life. Grant had invited a guest. My brother, stepping fully into the role of heir, had decided the smart move for a man about to run a farm was to get close to the buyer who kept it alive. So he'd reached out to the district manager of Ridgeline Markets, the biggest grocery operation in 3 counties, the very store I supposedly worked at, and invited him to Christmas dinner, to talk contracts over pie, to look in front of the whole family like a man with connections and a future. The district manager of Ridgeline Markets was Ray Dunmore. My brother had, with his own hand, invited to that table the one man in the county who knew exactly who I was, and who'd spent 2 years quietly itching to say it out loud. I found out when I pulled into the drive on Christmas Eve and saw an unfamiliar truck, and through the front window, Ray Dunmore standing in my father's living room, holding a beer he plainly didn't want, being told by my brother how the grocery business really works. Ray saw me through the glass. His eyebrows went up half an inch. I gave him the smallest shake of my head, not yet, not here, and he gave me a look back that said, plain as a receipt, that ship may already have left the dock. Inside, it was the good crystal and the smell of my mother's cinnamon coffee and 16 people in a warm house pretending we were the kind of family we photographed as. My father held court by the fire in the cardigan my mother gives him every year. Grant walked Ray around, introducing him as our contact at Ridgeline, and when he got to me, he said it the way he always said it. Easy, careless, a man handing you back your own coat. And this is my sister, Nora. She's over at the grocery store, so you two've probably crossed paths. Runs a register or something. That right, Nor? Ray Dunmore opened his mouth, and I caught his eye, and for the last time in my life, I asked a man to help my family go on pretending. Not tonight, I told him with my face. Let them have their Christmas. He closed his mouth. He was a decent man, but decent men only hold their peace until the moment you stop deserving it. And across the warm, bright room, my father was setting down his plate and getting to his feet and reaching for the good crystal. So, the toast. My father stood, and the room quieted the way a room does for a man it's decided to respect. And he lifted the good crystal, and he looked around at his people with the warmth of someone about to give them a gift. He talked about the land. He talked about legacy, about the next generation, about how a place like his needed a steady hand that understood the work. He put his other hand on Grant's shoulder, and then, because he could not resist tidying the story all the way to its edges, he turned to me with a smile that had no cruelty in it at all, only certainty, and he said it. Your brother inherits the farm. You can keep scanning groceries. There it was, 19 years, sanded down to 9 words. The table laughed. Not meanly. That's the part I keep coming back to. They laughed the easy laugh of people confirming something they already believed. Comfortable as an old hymn. My cousin, my uncle, Grant smirking into his wine. 16 people, and the candles, and my mother's cinnamon coffee going cold in its pot, and every one of them smiling at the smallness of me. I did not stand up. I did not cry. I did not reach for the thing I'd carried in my chest for years. I folded my hands in my lap, and I let the toast hang there in the candlelight, and I waited. Not for them. I was done waiting for them. I waited the way you wait when you already know the weather is about to change, and the other people in the field do not. People always blink when you refuse to perform the collapse they've prepared for. And into that silence, the manager of the biggest grocery chain in 3 counties set down his drink. Ray Dunmore had been standing by the window the whole time, a guest at a table where he was the only one who could read the room correctly. He put his beer on the sill. He crossed the floor, not fast, not angry, just done pretending, the way I'd asked him not to be and had no right to ask. And he stopped behind my father's chair, and he looked straight at me. And he said the words that ended the version of my family I'd spent my whole life holding up. Wait, aren't you the woman who built the homegrown program? A beat. The whole room turned. You're the homegrown woman. You kept every farm in this county from going under, this farm included. You're the reason there's a table to sit at." And the room went silent. Not a polite silence, a total one. Because here is the thing my father never understood about the ground he was standing on. Everyone at that table already knew about homegrown. They'd all been saved by it, or had a neighbor who was. They'd blessed it at their own suppers. Ruth Bishop had made it a legend at every kitchen table in the township. They knew the program the way you know the thing that kept your lights on. The only fact they'd never had was the name of the person behind it. And now a man they trusted, a man with no reason on earth to lie, was standing in my father's dining room and hanging that name on the woman my father had just told them could keep scanning groceries. Nobody needed a document. Nobody needed me to say a word. The math did itself all around that table, in real time. You could watch it move from face to face like a light going on down a row of houses. Grant's smirk fell off first. My uncle set down his fork. My cousin, who'd offered me up for the employee discount, went the color of the tablecloth. 16 people looked at me, and for the first time in 19 years, every single one of them was actually looking. And then it got worse, the way the truest things do, because my eyes went to my father, and my father was not surprised. That was the moment. Not the toast. This. Everyone else at that table had their whole world rearranging behind their eyes. But my father just sat there, his glass still half raised, his face doing the one thing a shocked face never does. Nothing. He wasn't discovering anything. He was being discovered. "You already knew," I said. It was the first thing I'd said all night. I said it quietly. So quietly the far end of the table leaned in. "Somebody from the co-op board told you, last winter. You've known for a year." He didn't deny it. He looked down at his hands, at the good crystal, at the table he'd built his whole story on, and the not denying was louder than any confession. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Grant said, "Dad?" Just that. Just the one word. The sound of an air feeling the floor tilt. And the room understood the second thing, the thing worse than the first, that my father had held this fact for a year, had carried it through every "she's over at the grocery store," had known exactly who I was on the night he raised a glass to tell me I was nothing, and had chosen the smaller daughter over the true one on purpose, because the true one didn't fit the story with his son at the center of it. I want to tell you I felt something grand in that moment, a rush, a vindication. I didn't. I felt tired. I felt the specific, bottomless tiredness of a woman who has just watched a thing she loved get told the truth and not survive it. I looked at my father not seeing me for the 10,000th time, and I did not think about 61 farms or a program or a career. I thought about a girl of 22 in a cold car with the heater ticking, waiting for a door to open. I thought, I would give all of it back right now to have had a father who'd said good job at that kitchen table 19 years ago and meant it. That's the truth that lives under the win. It was never about the farm. It was never about being right. It was about being seen by the one person who decided over and over not to look. What happened next, my father did entirely to himself. I didn't have to lift a hand. He cried first. My father, who thought tears were for people who'd lost the argument, put his face in his hand and said, "I built that place with my body, 50 years. I gave my whole life to that ground." And the table, which had always softened for him, did not soften. Nobody moved toward him. A man can weep for himself in a room full of people and get nothing back, and it is a terrible thing to watch, and I watched it. Then he blamed. He turned to my mother and said, "You knew. Carol, you must have known. You talked to her." And my mother, who has spent 40 years being the softest place in that house, opened her mouth to take it, to absorb it, to make it smooth the way she always did. And then she didn't. She looked at him, and she looked at me, and she closed her mouth and shook her head. One small refusal. 40 years in the making. My father had reached for the person who always caught him, and for the first time she stepped back. Then he threatened, because that's the last room in the house of a man like that. "Fine," he said, his voice going hard. "Fine. Then she can stay out of it. She's not in the will, she's not getting the farm, she can go back to her register." "I don't want the farm, Dad." That stopped him. "I never wanted the farm," I said. "I want you to hear that because you've spent a year believing the thing you were guarding was worth guarding from me. Keep it. Give it to Grant. It was never the farm." And I watched the last wall come down in him, because if it wasn't the farm I was after, then there was no version of this where he was the wise steward protecting the legacy. There was only a man who'd looked at his own daughter, seen exactly what she was, and lied about it to 16 people at Christmas. And that's when he said the truest thing he's said in 19 years. It came out of him small and horrified, almost a whisper, the words getting away from him before his pride could catch them. "You were supposed to need us." The room heard it. I heard it. And I understood finally and completely the whole architecture of my father, because that was the entire story in 5 words. I hadn't been erased for failing. I'd been erased for not needing them. As long as I was the useful, invisible one, the wall that held the house and asked for nothing, nothing, there was a place for me. The moment I turned out to be the one holding everyone up from the outside, on my own terms, without their permission, I broke the story. A daughter who saved you without needing you is a daughter you can't feel tall next to, so they'd chosen not to know. "I understand you," I said, and I did, completely, all the way down. "I've understood you my whole life." I stood and I picked up my coat. "Understanding you was never the problem. The problem is you used it as permission." My father said one more thing as I reached the door. He said it to my back, and it cost him everything he had, and it came 19 years too late and would not have cost him a single thing on time. He said, "I'm sorry." I didn't turn around, because "I'm sorry" to the back of a leaving woman is not for her. It's for the room. It's the last thing a man says to keep the others from thinking too badly of him. I'd watched him manage that table my whole life. I wasn't going to help him manage it one more time. I stopped at the door, though. I did give them one thing, not for him, for me, and for the 8-year-old I could feel watching from the stairs. "You were right about one thing, Dad." I said it quietly, no heat in it, the coldest calm I've ever felt. I did keep scanning groceries. I let that sit. Turns out that's the whole business. Everything I ever built, I built out of learning to see the person on the other side of the counter. You should try it sometime. Then I got my daughter's coat, and I took her hand, and we walked out into the snow. I didn't slam the door. Slamming a door means you still want something from the people inside. I pulled it shut behind me, soft as a held breath, and I let the cold latch click. And that click was the quietest, most final sound of my whole life. In the car, Poppy was silent for a long time, watching the farmhouse lights get small in the mirror. Then she said, "You didn't yell." Like she'd expected me to, like some part of her had been braced for it. "No," I said, "I didn't." And I reached into my coat pocket, past the folded funeral program with 9 names on it, and I took out the thing I'd carried for 19 years and never once shown a living soul. A cheap laminated name tag, the corners soft with age, the cheerful company font gone a little faded, Nora, happy to help. I set it on the dashboard where the light from the farmhouse could find it one last time. It doesn't judge, it doesn't argue, it doesn't clap, it just says my name, and under it, the truest thing anyone ever accidentally printed about me. Happy to help. I built a whole life on those 2 words, and it saved 61 farms, and it kept my father's lights on for 3 winters he'll never thank me for. The money was never the point. Being seen was, and it turned out the last person I needed to be seen by was the one holding the name tag. I'd still trade every farm I ever saved to hear him say good job one time and mean it. I want to be honest with you about that, all the way to the end. Winning didn't cure it. It just let me stop waiting for the cure. That was 7 months ago now. I'm still at Ridgeline. Homegrown renewed again this spring. 63 farms this year. We added 2. Poppy's in the 3rd grade and reads the world like a register. God help the world. I live in the same 2-bedroom apartment with the view of the parking lot, and I like it. And I'm not going anywhere fancier because the whole lesson of my father's life is what happens to a person who confuses the size of the house with the size of the love inside it. My father hasn't called. Grant did once, and started with, "Look, about Christmas," and I let him talk, and it wasn't an apology. It was a man testing whether the farm's grocery contract was safe. It is. I don't punish 61 families to make a point to one. He should know that about me by now. Maybe someday he will. And Ruth Bishop sent a card. No return address, just my name on the front in an old woman's careful hand, and inside 3 words and nothing else. Not "I'm sorry," not "congratulations," just "we always knew." So did I, in the end. It only took me 19 years and 1 raised glass to believe it. Keep your name tag, whatever they printed you as, help backup, the steady one, the one who'd be fine, keep it. One day somebody's going to read it out loud in the right room, and you're going to find out it was never the small thing they thought it was. It was the whole business.